In the year 2018, the very first episode of Cardboard City was released, which marked the beginning of my first ever stop-motion series. For the next couple years, episodes 2 through 24 followed, and while episodes 25, 26, and so on were expected to come out sometime after, instead, something else was released. My announcement confirming the cancellation of Cardboard City. But what exactly led to this? And where is this so-called video that's supposed to explain what led to this decision?
Well, you're watching it right now, but instead of telling you about what happened right away, I'm going to waste more of your time by walking you through how this little creation of mine came into existence and lived on for a few years before meeting its demise in late 2021. This is Cardboard Chaos. To start things off, we have to go all the way back to the summer of 2013 to talk about the video that surprisingly started it all.
This is Drift Match. If it looks unfamiliar to you, then that's because it was never released onto the channel. Keep in mind, the year is 2013, so this was a couple years before I created the channel. Anyway, this was nothing more than a short stop-motion video I made for my uncle in Japan. You see, during my trip to Japan the year before, my brother and I showed our relatives some of the home movies we had made over the last year. And because they were entertained by them, I decided to make a short movie showing off my lackluster video skills before leaving for Japan that summer.
Now, unfortunately, I can't play the original audio due to copyright music, but just imagine a video full of the same sound effects repeated over and over again. In fact, here's a little snippet. You get the idea. Now, I'm sure some of you may be thinking, what on earth does this have to do with Cardboard City? Well, don't worry, we're getting there.
So shortly after I made that video, we left for Japan, and the beginning of another vacation in the lovely land of the rising sun began. I showed my relatives the video and they enjoyed it. We stayed in Japan for 3 weeks doing all sorts of fun stuff, and that's pretty much about it. However, during our stay, there was one particular night when an idea suddenly popped into my head.
Now, I don't recall anything happening on that particular day that would spark such an idea, but just so happened on that night, the idea for a sequel to Drift Match just suddenly came to me. But it was more than just a sequel. It was a full-on series, and I was going to call it
Rapid Speed. Yes, I know, it's a pretty lame name. It would eventually be changed to Street Rules, but for a long time it was going to be called Rapid Speed. However, for this section of the documentary, I'm just going to call it Street Rules because it just sounds way cooler.
Anyway, as much as I'd love to tell you guys about this idea, I'm afraid I'll have to keep it as short as possible because this is the Cardboard City documentary, so instead I'll save it for another time. But here's what you do need to know about this series.
Street Rules was basically going to be a stop-motion series all about street racing, which was going to be written, directed, produced, and edited by yours truly. But in order to make this happen, I needed 1/18 scale cars, Lego people, roads, and buildings, which was going to be quite the budget.
Now, being a 12-year-old kid, it's normal to have outrageous ideas like this, so instead of being completely open about it, I decided to keep this project a secret. But how the hell did I acquire all the items?
Well, around this time, I was beginning to collect 1/18 scale cars after seeing a few videos of people's 1/18 car collections on YouTube, and because of the fact that they have a bit of a nostalgic feeling to them. To me, at least. But because I was a bit too young to get a job at that time, I asked my dad and grandmother to get some for me. Basically, I told them which ones I wanted, and then they would do their best to try to get them for me. And this went on for several years.
Now, unfortunately, I have a little bit of regret doing this because none of the money that was spent came out of my own pocket, and as you can see, I no longer have any of the cars, so yeah. But anyway,
with the cars taken care of, you might be asking yourselves, what about all the other things? Well, I figured that I would just use the Lego figures I already had, even if most of them were identical, and I could also create some new ones in LEGO Designer and find a way to persuade my parents to purchase them. Long story short, I never did create any new figures. As for the roads, well, I decided to just use the floor as it is because it was going to take way too much time and money to construct them. But what about the buildings? Ah yes, the key component that ties the two series together. Besides the 118 cars.
Well, if you recall, this whole operation was meant to be kept as a secret, so I couldn't just go ask my parents to buy me a bunch of cardboard to construct the buildings. I mean, that would reveal the whole thing. And to be quite frank, I don't think I would have been able to bring myself to ask for something like that. So, in order to construct the buildings, I needed to find a substitute. Enter the tissue box.
Now, I honestly can't remember how I even came up with the idea of using tissue boxes to create the buildings, but the reason I did is because I realized that they allowed me to collect cardboard without having to ask my parents to buy some for me for this project. So for the next couple years, I saved up as many tissue boxes as I could and kept them hidden away in my closet. And then finally, during the summer of 2016, I began to construct the buildings. But unfortunately for me, the construction process didn't go too well, and I ended up shelving the project. But then about a year later, I decided to work on the buildings again. After the release of Joker Fun in the late summer of 2016, I suddenly regained the motivation to make videos again, and after doing so for nearly a year, I was determined to finally get started on turning Street Rules into a reality. The project had been in development for 4 years at that point, and during that time, the plot for the first few episodes had went through many changes. But now that I had settled on plots I was happy with, along with most of the props I needed, it was finally time to start working on it.
So after constructing several buildings, I felt the need to test them out to make sure that they actually worked, even if they looked extremely cheesy. And to do this, I needed to create a little test video. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the character that you all are most likely familiar with, Giant Kirby.
That's right. Little did you know, Giant Kirby was actually made as a test to see how the buildings would perform in a video.
Now the story of how Giant Kirby came to be is actually a bit more complex, but like Street Rules, it's a story for another time. The main takeaway here though is that Giant Kirby helped me conclude that the buildings were good to go, despite having the little flaps at the top.
Yeah, for some reason I felt like keeping those on there for a long time. I guess it's because they help block out some portions of the background that would ruin the illusion, and I figured that some may view them as a roof for the buildings. Anyway, after that test, I went back to create some more buildings to allow me to create larger settings and to fabricate the illusion of moving around in the city, rather than being stuck in one location. Once I completed them, I created another test video, which you might be familiar with. Yeah, it's not very good. But let's rewind a bit. During the construction of the second batch of buildings, I was trying to brainstorm some other ideas that would allow me to use them. At this point, the main purpose of them was for Street Rules, but I figured that I could use them for other projects. One of these ideas was of course Giant Kirby vs. Wheeljack, but there was one other idea that was developed.
Around this time, I was still trying very hard to develop videos that would hopefully gain more traffic to my channel, which is not very easy to do if you refuse to appeal to the YouTube algorithm. Luckily for me, I was able to come up with an idea that would not only allow me to reuse the buildings, but also have the possibility of gaining a bit more attention towards the channel. And that idea was called
Grand Theft Auto Cardboard City. The idea sort of came about when Sean thought about having myself, Deadshot, and Bucky in a video together. At that time, we were like the three main figures on the channel. You know, we each had our own video, and there weren't really a whole lot of other characters present in his videos. The whole thing was inevitable. I mean, it was bound to happen at some point, and I think we all knew that. It was the start of something, I wouldn't call it beautiful, but definitely something revolutionary for the channel.
Now, even though I believed I hit the jackpot with this idea, it actually took me a while to figure out what the video would be like. Would it be at the beginning of the game? Would it just be one mission? Would it be free roam?
With all the different options, it was difficult to come up with a solid idea. But then one night, something unexpected happened. While trying to brainstorm ideas for the video, a wave of ideas suddenly came to me. Some of the most notable ones were having the Joker as the main character, having a gang of bears occasionally attack you throughout the story, and my personal favorite, a parody of the famous tuna scene from The Fast and the Furious. Now, even though I had a lot of ideas, I could only pick so many for two main reasons. First of all, half of these ideas were doable, but half of them were just flat out impossible to do. Like giving all members of the bear gang their own Fast and Furious car. That would just be way too expensive. And second of all, Cardboard City was meant to be only one video.
Remember, Street Rules was my main focus, not some random idea I just suddenly came up with. So, I narrowed down the ideas to the ones that were feasible, picked out the best ones, and created a plan for the project. And then, at the beginning of 2018, I started to film GTA Cardboard City.
The filming process went off to a good start, but I couldn't help but feel like I was filming more cutscenes than gameplay footage. Even though I tried to balance them out, I still had the feeling that the video would feel more like watching a movie than playing a game. Regardless, I kept on filming and going along with the plan. But then, something happened that changed everything. You might recall a very quick heist scene from episode 1, which only lasted about 20 seconds. In the original take, it was around 40 seconds to a minute. So what happened? Well, the original scene was meant to be a part where the player would get to control the vehicle to complete the mission. And even though the original runtime ended up being relatively short, it actually took me an entire day to film it. But after spending hours and hours filming this one scene, the end result was a disaster.
Now, unfortunately, I do not have the original take, but it was pretty close to looking something like this.
As you can see here, the camera is extremely shaky. For all of my videos, I always used the standard built-in camera app on every iPhone, and during this time, I was unaware of the concept of a camera grid to help me line things up. Plus, the camera grid may have not been available to enable at that time. So I pretty much had to guess that the car was somewhat in the center and a certain distance away from the camera. But obviously, that plan backfired. He was devastated. You know, an entire day of filming gone to waste. So, had to go back to the drawing board. Now, the idea of converting the entire video into a standard stop-motion movie was nothing new because, as I mentioned before, I felt like I was filming more cutscenes than gameplay footage. But removing the video game aspect would have meant that I would have to drop GTA from the title, which I really did not want to do. But what other choice did I have? All the gameplay scenes probably would have been terrible if I stuck with the original plan. And what about Street Rules? I wanted to get started on that as soon as possible. What the hell am I supposed to do? You may be surprised to hear this, but it actually didn't take very long for me to come up with a solution. You see, while I was filming Cardboard City, I realized that it may have had some potential. Maybe not in terms of me getting views, but just for myself. I realized how much I enjoyed making videos with these characters, and having them all interact in a world together is pretty awesome. But what about Street Rules? I've wanted to make this series for over 4 years. It's my dream, right? Well, after doing some thinking, it all came down to this. I could either pursue Street Rules and do the same thing over and over again, or I could mix things up a bit with Cardboard City. In the end, I think you all know which one I chose. Street Rules was gone, and Cardboard City was here to stay. Now, I won't lie, it was difficult to let go of a project that I had wanted to do for a long time, but realistically, it never would have worked out. First of all, just because a stop-motion series about street racing sounded and looked cool in my head, it probably wouldn't have been executed well with my low budget. It didn't matter how many skylines I had, it would have been terrible. And secondly, have you ever worked with Lego people? it would have been an absolute nightmare. But with Cardboard City, not only would it allow me to use the buildings and 118 cars, but it also allowed me to use plushies of characters that are easily distinguishable and much easier to work with. I think he made the right call picking Cardboard City because I honestly don't think he would have been very happy doing Street Rules. All he cares about is the views, and he still does to this day. Are you sure about that? I guarantee it.
Now, even though I felt pretty confident about my decision to go with Cardboard City, I was not as confident about my voice acting skills. At that time, I was very self-conscious about my voice, so recording the lines for the first episode was a huge challenge. In fact, I recall recording them at least 5 times before just going along with what I had, And I somehow managed to make them worse by messing around with the audio levels in iMovie, so luckily I became more comfortable with my voice later on.
So after many hours of filming and editing, on February 4th, 2018, the very first episode of Cardboard City was released, and within the first week it gained 4 likes. So overall, not a bad start. I know the results are pretty pathetic, but honestly, even if I did include GTA in the title, I doubt it would have gained any further attention. But I did leave in a few video game references throughout to pay tribute to the original idea.
Anyhow, that's pretty much everything that led up to the first episode of Cardboard City. So, what happens next? Well, 3 days after the release, my dad watches it, and he sends me a message asking me, is Harley Quinn going to appear in the next one? Well, I don't know. Does she? Tune in to part 2, and I'll walk you through the episodes that followed the debut.
If Cardboard City had an opening song, what would you pick? Well, Sean actually had the idea of using Rezophonic's Can You Hear Me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? He used that in episode 2, right? Yeah. We actually had plans to do an official opening, but that project got scrapped.
ありがとう。